Our Stigma, Episode 3, Season 1.
Hi, this is Seth Perry. Today's episode will mention overdose death, violence, trauma, and sexual assault. Check out the show notes for resources if you need help today. Remember, you can always dial 988 if you are in crisis. Before we begin today's episode, I want to give you the questions of the day. Ponder this throughout the episode. Here it is. What would it be like if your community came together to explore the deeper roots of mental health and addiction challenges in Indigenous communities today? How would that conversation go? When, if ever, has your community had a conversation about this issue? Now let's dive in. Now, there's one thing I haven't told you about Scandia, Minnesota. This small town where I serve as pastor is unapologetically Swedish in its identity. The local heritage museum, the Gammelgarden, is dedicated to preserving Swedish history. The church's entry arch has Swedish Lutheran Church carved in stone. And the name Scandia, well, that speaks for itself. But if you visit Scandia, there's something you can't miss: the Dala horses. These 4-foot-tall Swedish folk statues are everywhere, in front of the law office, city hall, the store, the museum, and even the elementary school. There's even one dressed like a pastor. Yet one Dala horse has always stood out to me. It's the largest in Scandia, displayed in the museum lobby, a piece of art titled Svea. On its side is the depiction of an Indigenous man in a headdress. I've always wondered about it. So to learn more, I sat down with Lynne Moratzka, a local historian, memory keeper, and director emerita of the Gammelgarden Museum. Dala horses were everywhere in the home that I grew up in because my grandfather came from Dalarna, Sweden. And Swedish heritage is big here. And as far as I can tell, I see two depictions of Indigenous people on display. One of them is the Dala horse in the museum entitled Svea. So what is the importance of the biggest Dala horse in Scandia that's entitled Svea?
Svea is a wooden horse, 1,600 pounds, and it was commissioned by Svea organization, SWEA, Swedish Women's Educational Association. When they were celebrating their 40th anniversary as an organization, they asked all the chapters to consider sponsoring a horse, a Dala horse that would be made in Sweden, and then to decorate it to tell their particular story. And the artwork on it was inspired from a tapestry that's on display in Sweden that shows the story of migration to Minnesota. But when you go into the Velkommen hus and look at her, start reading on her tail end and read towards her nose on her right flank. And it starts out with the profile of a Native American in the woods with lots of the coniferous pine trees and the river that is the St. Croix, which is how the immigrants traveled inland. And then as you progress around it, it starts to show the grid from the 1862 land grant when they started to open up the land for free farming and ownership after 5 years. But they included the rivers and the pine trees, and they added the buffalo. And then as you go around the horse, it shows the march of immigration and more Scandinavians coming in and such.
Having a conversation about Indigenous people in Scandia, it has always worried me a little bit, just talking to your average person that lives here now. One issue is the Minnesota state flag. It was a contentious issue. The flag was changed about a year ago. The old flag depicts a Native American riding off while a white settler plowed his field. That is how some people saw the flag, right? And it was seen as a reference to the forced removal and relocation of Native Americans as white settlers expanded And so the old state flag, it still flies in our cemetery. However, you as the local historian know the immense disruption that colonization has had on Indigenous people. And so why is it so difficult to talk about sometimes?
I think so many of the generations that had their root in immigration, in the Scandinavian immigration, are now 5 or 6 generations from the immigrant group. And so the stories of how hard it is to be an immigrant and to learn to live in a new culture, a new climate, a new language, all of that, have been diminished in their keeping. And so they have forgotten their family stories, or they haven't even been told their family stories. And it's hard work to become an immigrant and to be on the outside of a culture looking in, when most people prefer to be on the inside looking out. The Swedish experience was with the Samis, who followed reindeer like the Plains Indians followed the buffalo. There's common denominators there. The Swedish government did not recognize the Sami nation, the Sami people, as a nation until 1962. And now they have their own legislative body and whatnot. Earlier than that, the Samis had to declare a nationality for the purposes of having education, healthcare, etc. And there are some subtleties, as there are in every culture of people. You could tell a Russian Sami from a Norwegian by the color of their clothes or some of the embellishments, that sort of thing. But it always seems to be that the incoming group diminishes the value of the indigenous peoples.
You know, I want to say this, having conversations like the one we're having right now, and to have two people sit down and talk about assumptions that people may have about Indigenous culture, they are uncomfortable conversations. So I think we are entering into an uncomfortable conversation just sitting down and talking about this. Some people might say that, hey, I've personally not done anything to mistreat an Indigenous person. My ancestors came here from Sweden and they were resourceful. They made a life for themselves. This sentiment is not too far off from what my grandpa Oli would have thought or said. And so how would you appeal to someone's compassionate side if they had that kind of take on history?
Well, first I would say, how much of your own family story have you heard? How many of the stories of how hard it was to enter the United States or to leave Sweden or whatever country you come from? It is unrealistic to think this enmity between cultures didn't exist in other countries. And the other fun part of it is often when you say to someone, and we had this happen with a young man, he was maybe 18 years old, and he brought his grandma on Mother's Day for a tour because she was Swedish. And he said, yeah, she's Swedish. And I said, well, so are you? And he looked at me and he said, I am? And all I could think of was, where were you in biology class that this escaped you? But he was dumbfounded to think of himself in those terms. And I think that's part of the problem.
If we're going to compare this to Indigenous people, the folks that I've spoken to, the elders that I've spoken to, that there's a major disconnect, right? It's not just from immigration, it's from colonization. So thinking about what you just said, how sometimes people here who are maybe 8th generation aren't necessarily as connected to their Swedish roots. When you think about folks who have been taken off their land, how do you feel when you think about their experience?
They were only doing what anybody would do. They were defending their lifestyle, their territory, their identity. And they were, a bad pun, but they were outgunned by the government and by a lot of the attitude of leadership, who were immigrants themselves from eastern United States to the territory of Minnesota. And they were here for other reasons. They were here to extract riches from it. And then the immigrants, the more recent immigrants, started coming in, and they were here to survive and find a lifestyle for their family that was denied them in their home country. They were having a tough go there. It couldn't be any worse, so we're out of here. We're coming to Minnesota, and we have the possibility. And by then, a lot of the indigenous peoples were already erased from the neighborhood.
I'll be honest, this episode's topic makes me a little uneasy, especially when I consider broaching the topic in a community with deep Swedish immigrant roots. For one, I grew up in a family with a Swedish immigrant identity where we didn't talk about uncomfortable things. Colonization certainly wasn't a dinner table topic. And second, when I bring up generational trauma or the erasure of indigenous people, some folks get defensive, as if I'm pointing fingers. But here's the truth. Many of us, myself included, carry biases, whether we live in rural, urban, or suburban settings. Still, we need to face the stark realities. Indigenous people here experience opioid overdose deaths at 10 times the rate of white Minnesotans, and they continue to face countless public health barriers. We have to talk about that. I'm Seth Perry, and this is Our Stigma. Our Stigma is a production of Good Faith Media. This production has been made possible with funding from the Washington County Opioid Settlement. The Our Stigma podcast is sponsored by M Health Fairview's Community Faith Partners Network. Let's start with a quick exercise. Think about the cultural traditions of your family, your faith community, or your hometown. Now imagine all of it, your language, holidays, spiritual practices being forcibly taken from you. Imagine being removed from the land that you call home. That's one way to begin to understand generational trauma as it affects Indigenous people in North America. To explore how this trauma connects to mental health and addiction, this episode brings you two perspectives, one from an Indigenous person in long-term recovery and one in early recovery. I want you to meet Richard Wright, also known as Black Crow. He's an Ojibwe from the Leech Lake Band, a proud member of the Bear Clan, Pillager Band. Richard is a graduate of the St. Paul Seminary and studied at the University of Minnesota with a focus on community corrections. He has over 3 decades of experience as a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. I met with him a few times at the American Indian Family Center and at the Minneapolis Indian Health Board. How long have you been in recovery?
40 years sober.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
I didn't go to treatment.
Mm-hmm.
I was sitting at a bar at 8 o'clock. I opened up the bar and sitting there with a drink, and I said to myself, if it's going to stop, it has to stop right now. Not later on today, not tomorrow, not next week, right now.
Right now. So what year was it that you got clean and sober?
September 27th at 8:05 is what I identify to. Yeah. 1986.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm. What I thought about is going into treatment, but then I thought about that 12-step program, and the first step is admitting to being an alcoholic, that my life has become unmanageable. And I wasn't ready to say I was an alcoholic, because that's not the Indian way. What we say is, Nijimo and Miu and Ja, there's something that's going on with you that seems to be getting the best of you. And so gather your helpers together. And your helpers are those ceremonial elders that perform healing sessions with. Sometimes it's done on an individual basis, or sometimes it's done in a group. So what I really started to do was to try to find out who I was as an Indian person. I didn't really know that part of me that was doing all that drinking. That wasn't me. I had to find my cultural identity. I knew how to speak Ojibwa. I knew I was Ojibwa. I knew I was 100% Ojibwa. I knew my band. I knew my clan. And in order for me to heal in the physical sense, I took up dancing. I entered the Powwow Circle. and started to dance traditionally, and that helped me a lot because that involved attending a lot of ceremonies just to prepare to get ready to enter that arbor, that circle. And then I started to talk to elders, and I asked them using the tobacco. I went to them and I said, I want to enter the circle because that's a ceremonial aspect too, to be recognized by your community, right? And we danced around the arbor once, and then everybody joined in. All the dancers, I mean, probably, I don't know, a good 500-600 dancers behind you, just showing their support, the cultural retribution to wanting to change one's life and become somebody who's in recovery, not only from oneself, but from that alcohol. And so that was a ritual that I think it propelled me more into finding out who I was.
After the break, we'll meet with someone who has a connection to their culture through dancing just like Richard. But first, here's this. Talking about mental health and addiction stigma in faith communities shouldn't stop when the episode ends. That's why Our Stigma is more than just a podcast. It's a conversation starter. If you're a community organizer, faith leader, in recovery, or just passionate about community building, I've got a free resource just for you, the Our Stigma Podcast Educational Curriculum. It's a discussion guide designed to help you lead meaningful dialogue on mental health, recovery, and outreach in your community. You can download the Leader Guide and discussion resource today at www.ourstigma.com. That is www.ourstigma.com. Welcome back. You are about to meet someone who also has a connection to their culture through dancing. This is Tanya. Tanya is currently in treatment, and she made time to speak with me about her journey. What nation do you belong to? Go ahead and share that.
I belong to the Hunkpapa Nation in Standing Rock, Little Eagle in South Dakota.
So you grew up in the city, in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Did you feel connected to your culture?
Yes, of course. I smudged a lot. I went to a couple sweats when I was younger. I got my first eagle feather when I was 12 in a ceremony. When I went to a camp in Red Lake, I used to dance fancy shawl dancing. Like, I used to be into it a lot, but when I grew up and moved back with my father, I was introduced into drinking and doing drugs, and that pulled me away from that life. If I don't have my faith and if I don't have my culture, I feel as if I don't have anything.
Treatment has historically existed in a 12-step model. The 12 steps, they work for some, but not everyone. Richard already spoke about the 12 steps, so I decided to get more input on the cultural compatibility of the 12 steps. What are some aspects of it that you find difficult, and maybe even specifically how treatment centers that have adopted a 12-step model and 12-step groups, how they operate? What are some of those things that are challenging to fit into the Indigenous cultural identity?
There's a lot of prohibition of our culture inside a residential, most levels of care won't allow us to bring our medicines there. Our medicines are sage, cedar, tobacco, not the commercial tobacco, but the kind we make, which we call a sema, and the sweetgrass and the eagle feather, and we do water ceremonies, right? Water is precious to us as Indian people because it's life-giving. We're almost all water, and we have to take care of ourselves. I was talking to two people. One was the Indian women that I had sent to treatment who had a baby while she was in treatment. And when they took her to the hospital, she took her medicines with her. And the attending nurse told her, You can't bring that in here. It's not allowed for you to do that. You have to call somebody to bring that home to where you live, because we can't accommodate it right here. And this made the woman anxious and fearful, because she needed that to bring forth that new life, right? But also to know that she was in a place where she could probably heal for the life of that baby that she was bringing forth. It's all spiritual. And the outcome of that is she says, I want to talk to a hospital advocate because I need this medicine here at my bedside. And they sent her an advocate, and she said after that they reassigned a nurse to her. They allowed her to keep her medicines, but she believes it helped her and propelled her to move forward, to have that safety and comfort of knowing that those spiritual medicines were there to purify herself before she brought that baby out.
Back with Tanya, as I've been interviewing her, I noticed that she's wearing something around her neck. And so right now, you have a leather pouch around your neck. Can you share with me about that?
It's a medicine bag. I carry my mom's ashes, I carry sage, I carry tobacco, sweetgrass, and I pray with it every single day. And it gives me strength. It gives me the ability to get up, to remember that I have another day to fight for, that the people where I come from, it's good medicine.
The small leather pouch around Tanya's neck plays a vital role in her grieving process. To those unfamiliar with the history and significance of Indigenous ceremony and medicine, it might seem like an ordinary object. But the pouch filled with sage, sweetgrass, cremains, and tobacco is anything but. It carries profound spiritual meaning. Richard Wright offers a deeper understanding of the sacred medicine it contains, illuminating its importance to him and his people.
We could not even practice these without going to jail prior to the American Indian Freedom of Religious Act of 1978. That wasn't that long ago. They said, now you can legally use your medicines, right? Yeah. And I'm not kidding, we could go to jail. That pipe that you see there, they didn't allow us to use that. Yeah, but that's the mainstay of our culture, is that pipe there. Yeah, we use it to say a prayer for ourselves. There's people that are picking up this pipe, and I listen to them, and they say, I'm a pipe carrier. They make that proclamation, right? And I always think, well, think about this a little bit more. I said, that pipe cakes carry you, right? Yeah. Used in a good spiritual way, it'll take care of you. Yeah, so... But we call it a siniwan. It's a sacred rock. Yeah, a sacred rock. Those rocks are present in all of our healings. When you go to the sweat lodge, there's rocks in there. A siniwan, Manadua key. Rocks are spirits of the earth, right? Tell that to a psychologist, and they'll probably want to put you on some kind of medication. I talk to rocks.
One mental health professional that certainly won't find it peculiar that Richard talks to rocks is Steve Delisi. Here is his take on the massive disparity in the mental health care of Indigenous people. When he and I spoke about Indigenous people, he brought up generational trauma.
I am a neuroscientist at heart, and I look to what does science tell me about generational and historical traumas. And we are learning about the effects of those traumas on the epigenetic changes in our our bodies and our brains. There are real physical changes that occur within the context of those historical and generational traumas.
Here, I want to share a specific example of generational trauma that Richard shared with me when we spoke. How would you explain to me how generational trauma is somehow connected in with public health issues like that?
Well, it goes back to the boarding school era. I believe that's where children were forcibly removed from reservations and sent all over the country, even into Canada. This one woman that I know, that she's in her 90s now, was in a boarding school in Alaska, and the nun came and gave her a little note one night. She looked at it and she couldn't read English. She didn't, so she stuck it in her pocket until she found some other young kid that read it for her that understood English. And what it says is, your brother died last night. Now that was weeks ago, right? She didn't have any knowledge because they didn't tell her, well, where did you bury him? What did you do with his body? What happened to them is only being discovered right now, because we're talking about tens of thousands of kids' bodies being discovered at boarding school sites. Just with recent technology and the radar and the ability to look into the ground and find mass graves down there, just small children.
And so by acknowledging that the traumas have occurred, by opening up a safe place for another human being who has experienced those traumas to share them with me at their own timing and when they have trusted that it is safe to do so, then that opens us up to be able to then explore and look at individually for them and through their family and then their communities, how has that trauma been manifested in some of what they seek the treatment for from a psychiatrist or other healthcare professionals. I think that's how it needs to start there. And then we need culturally directed evidence-based treatment that directly addresses their culturally specific needs.
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to see that, Seth, but across healthcare, that's really at some of the earliest stages of development.
I'll use myself as an example again. When I first showed signs of a mental health condition at age 17, I was quickly taken to a psychiatrist. Later, when I needed addiction treatment, my family made sure I got help right away. The 12 steps and the concept of spirituality that supported my recovery aligned closely with my Christian upbringing. The mental health and addiction services available to me reflected my identity. In contrast, Tanya shares a very different and more challenging journey.
I'm schizophrenic. Also, I have depression, a lot of anxiety. I hear things, sometimes I see things, and for me not to be on the red road, that's when the voices and everything get worse than what it is now.
When I met you, you said that you are trying to stay on the red road to recovery. Can you share with me what that means to you?
The red road is to be sober and to be willing to fight for my people, to break the generational curse off of everybody and stuff, so that my children and my grandchildren have a second chance at life other than being to an addictive family.
Richard also deals with a mental health diagnosis of a different type. In order for us to hear about that, we'll have to go all the way back to the 1970s.
And I was looking at my orders one day, and it says my name and my rank and serial number, And my orders were to report to the Republic of Vietnam. Yeah. Of course, they gave me 30 days of leave before I actually went. Yeah. So I ended up going over there for the year, and that ended my 3-year enlistment. But it raised hell with me over there, and I brought it back here and started drinking heavily just to cope with my PTSD, right? Those are just people. They're just like us. In fact, there was a prisoner of war that I was talking to. He knew limited English, but he was sitting next to me one time, and he goes like this. He goes, same color. Yeah, and then the idea was you searched him, and you for intelligence gathering. And I looked through his wallet, opened it up. I had to. Picture of his wife and his kids in there. Yeah, that's why I say they're just people. And we were blasting the hell out of their villages.
The details that Richard shares about war are too much to share in this series. They are harrowing. And as he continues to talk, I am deeply moved in a completely different way when he describes his homecoming.
First experience coming back into the world was at Dulles Airport in Washington, where I landed. And I didn't have any money with me, right? It was tied up in bonds. I mean, they make you put your money in bonds. And I was $3 short of getting a ticket back to Minneapolis. So I walked around. I was actually begging people. I said, I need $3 to get home. Can you help me? And they avoided me because I had my uniform on. Yeah. That's what I think anyway. Maybe it's been their own decision that I don't give out money to people that ask me for money. Eh? Yeah. So eventually, my mother had given me a watch that she said to me before I left is, I'm giving you this watch and I want you to come back, right? And I said, okay. And so I wore that watch all that time. But I had to sell that watch to get enough money to get on the plane so I could make it back here. That was the only way I could get the money. I even went to, there's a place in these airports, military areas where you can get help. Yeah, travelers, kind of like a traveler's aid, but it was soldiers only. They wouldn't help me either. Wow. But when I hit Minneapolis, then I started drinking.
Generational trauma is one thing, but PTSD is another. And it turns out both Richard and Tanya have experienced trauma. Tanya experienced this trauma on the streets. Has there ever been a time in your life where you haven't had stable housing? And if so, what was that like?
10 years of my life. I had no idea where I'm going to go get my food. I had no idea if I was safe with the people that I was safe with. I was very abused. I was raped a few times out there. You know, I didn't have anybody out there to turn to. I was out there for years. I was lost. I didn't know anybody. And I don't know, my daughter came to the tents where I was at and she said, Mom, I'm getting you out of here. And my cousin came every week for a month. And finally I said, you know what? All right, I'm going to go to treatment. And I had no energy in me at all to fight anymore. I had none. And then I prayed when I was there I asked God, I said, give me the desire so I can open up my heart again to people. Because I was always abused out there. I only knew the life of being lower than somebody. I never felt equal to nobody.
I can't listen to Tanya's perspective without thinking about my own life. No matter how hard things got with my dual diagnosis, I always felt rooted and supported. So let's get on to the topic of ancestry and how important that is to mental and emotional health. I can trace my family back generations. I grew up with a solid understanding of what shaped my cultural identity. Knowing all of this, I had a specific question for Richard. My ancestry goes back to Sweden. My grandfather came through Ellis Island. I know what part of Sweden that he grew up in, and I've known that my whole life. But for an Indigenous person, they may not know those things. If they understand that, why is that important for their mental health and if they deal with addiction?
I think we have to go back and look at our history and find out just how the government oppressed our culture. And they formed reservations. They placed us on reservations. There was a time when you couldn't leave the reservation unless you had permission. Kind of like a soldier getting a pass, right? In fact, in my age, I've experienced persons going into a town to get groceries and seen by the police, and the police will usher them out of the city in what they call a floater law, right? It allowed the police to take somebody outside the city and say, "Don't come back here. If I see you, you're going to jail."
Richard's story tells the tale of a people that have suffered for too long. And after the break, we are going to look and see if anything is actually changing. The Our Stigma podcast is produced by Good Faith Media, a reliable resource contributing to conversations at the intersection of faith and culture. My friends at Good Faith Media use multiple media platforms. Their flagship podcast is Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. Each week, the co-hosts discuss current events and issues, engage the lighter side, and interview faith leaders from around the world. Learn more about the podcast and the nonprofit Good Faith Media at goodfaithmedia.org. So, thinking about everything that has been shared today, you might wonder, is anything changing? Is the government doing anything to assist the public health of Indigenous people in Minnesota? Now, I'm back with Republican Representative Dave Baker. When I brought Representative Baker a question about diversity, equity, and inclusion, he had this to say.
I've been pretty nervous in the last 3 months with this discussion as I'm making this project and as I'm talking to other people, because this project was funded really because diversity, equity, and inclusion were at the core, to talk about recovery through that lens. So what assurances can you really give Minnesotans that culturally specific treatment will continue to expand in Minnesota?
So my work for the last 10 years, in the last couple years here in Minnesota, the DEI thing has really blown up. I think that we've been doing a very good job prior to the DEI expansion of what does that really mean. What I have learned in the Indigenous community, the seven grandfathers method is super important to them. Understanding the generational pain that they've gone through, understanding that they are getting a lot of different help nationally from their Iniqua boards and other things like that. They are doing much better. Our healing grants to going to the Native American communities are different and way more flexible than other areas are getting because that's what they need. But we also, with the state taxpayer dollars, we just can't hand our money out because we actually are held accountable. So the DEI thing, to me, I don't get hung up on those initials. I don't get, like, this is not my thing to die on at all. I'm going to help anybody, what color they are, where they're from, because every community is different. And if it's done anything for me, my work in the substance use disorder is that every community wants to heal different. And so I'm not going to kind of buy into the fear of all this stuff and the retraction of it all. It's always a part of this discussion because culture matters when it comes to substance use disorder. So again, I don't get hung up on what's going on statewide or nationally. I just want to help people who want to get help. And it's different for some of those communities. So that, I hope that answered your question, maybe not, but I keep fighting that same stigma of, well, gosh, this community is different, or are you really diving into this? We are just trying to find all the resources we can to help the Somalians, the Black Americans, the Indigenous, and so on. So, but they're all different, and they all have to be specific. Yep.
Yeah, I understand that.
Just to clarify, Dave Baker is a Republican, but he's a state representative. He's not in the White House. And I say that because when I brought up what I talked to Representative Baker about with Richard Wright, here is what happened.
When you think about how things are going in this country right now, what are your greatest concerns?
I can't answer that without being political, but this current administration is cutting a lot of federal monies that's intended for the tribes.
When Richard references federal funding cuts to indigenous nations and tribes, he's specifically talking about the numerous federal freezes and cuts made by the current administration in the White House. Richard and I talk at length about the treaties that were established in the 1800s and 1900s that provided, among other things, medical services to indigenous peoples. When it comes to mental health and addictions, Richard says that local addiction treatment services are at stake.
We still advocate that we want our own treatment facilities. Every reservation in Minnesota now has it on an outpatient level. There's very few inpatient. There's one in Bemidji, and there's one in Sawyer, Minnesota, called Mashkawasan. Bemidji has Oshkimanadu. Yeah. So those are the only two residential treatment programs that exist in Minnesota. Do we need more? Yes, we need more. To take them off the street. My reservation sends people to residential treatment in Florida, then brings them back to this toxic environment where all this started anyway, right?
Addiction and mental health services for Indigenous Minnesotans fall under the responsibility of the DFL Party of Minnesota, the Democrats. Minnesota has a Democratic governor, and Jeremy Drucker works for Governor Tim Walz. So I brought him a difficult question on a topic that Richard and I have spoken about. Are Indigenous Americans being phased out of existence on an administrative level? So speaking about Indigenous Minnesotans, I've heard two specific things that stick out in the work that I've done with them in partnering and having discussions around this for this project. And number one, many Indigenous Minnesotans are concerned about their blood quantum and their right to tribal membership down the road for their generations ahead of them as well, that there will be less and less Indigenous people on paper for the state with their tribal status. And ultimately, I see this as a public health issue. It affects mental health and addiction treatment as well. And the other thing that they're concerned about is that there is a tenfold disparity in opioid overdose statistics between white Minnesotans and Indigenous Minnesotans, which when I learned that, which I just learned that in December, is relatively troubling. So why are we still dealing with severe barriers and inequity in this particular cultural group?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a huge issue. It's something that we are really laser focused on here at the state and in the Office of Addiction and Recovery. I think as to the question of why, I think we just have to acknowledge that intergenerational trauma is real, that what our parents experience, what our grandparents experience, what our great-grandparents experience, that all gets passed down, and that intergenerational poverty is real, and there's statistics that show it. And so these things accumulate throughout history and lead us to where we are today. And so I think, it starts by acknowledging that that's a huge part of the problem. And I think it requires and it calls upon us to think about solutions differently, to think about what are the things that are going to give folks that they can identify with in this community. And so traditional healing is a significant component of that. Another thing is that we hear all the time with our tribal leaders and Indigenous leaders, culture is prevention, culture is treatment, and culture is recovery. And so again, how can we meet those people where they are, have really person-centered programming that gives them that connection to their past, that gives them that cultural meaning and connection, because we know that that will produce better outcomes.
Good. Checking back with Tanya, she explains why she has been very enthusiastic about her future.
So currently, you just took a little milestone. Now, tell me about these. How many days are you at right now?
I'm right now at 120 days.
So let's sum up those 120 days. Can you share with me how you got to this point where you're confident speaking about your mental health and your faith and your addiction in a way, and also your grief too, right? So what's different this time?
Because I was doing it for everybody else. I was doing it for my children. I was doing it for my kids. I was doing it for everybody else, but I never once took the time to do it for me, to be selfish, to see the things that I need to heal. And I wanted to be selfish with it and start the healing. And right now, I'll tell you the honest truth, I only have myself, And if I want to do something for my children, I gotta work hard for it. Before I was only meeting God halfway, and now I gotta meet him all the way. If I want to be sober, I'm gonna have to work for it, yes, but I just think it's because I'm doing it for me right now. And I'm not out there waiting for someone to say, you know what, good job and stuff. Like, I'm actually proud of who I am right now. And yes, I get temptations to use and everything and stuff, but I usually pray for that. I pray upon everything that I do. I don't want to live my life one way and say that I'm doing it like for the better, for my good, and then go out and do something else differently.
I want to be clear about something. I'm a pastor and I'm a Christian. That's central to who I am. But I don't believe everyone needs to believe in Jesus or be saved in the way that I understand salvation. Tanya is sharing about her faith in Jesus and her Indigenous spiritual beliefs. That's where she is right now in her spiritual journey, and that's okay. Many recovery programs and support groups include Christian principles, sometimes without much thought about how that might affect people from other traditions. For example, many 12-step meetings still close with the Lord's Prayer. But for some Indigenous peoples, especially when we remember the legacy of the church-run boarding schools that Richard mentioned earlier, that can be deeply painful. Richard offers this as something important to consider.
So to someone who is a hardcore AA big book thumper, and let's just say they would say, hey, yeah, an Indigenous person has a problem with alcohol, they can work the steps, which have kind of Christian roots, and they can go to meetings, and the meetings end with the Lord's Prayer. What are some of the problems that your average Indigenous person would encounter with that kind of program?
I've had that question brought to me in a lot of instances, and what I try to let them know, that person that is that I'm talking to, is I say, yeah, God, the word God does appear in those systems that help to treat you, but think of it like this. Think of it in a more spiritual way, that you're living life in a good, orderly direction, right? It's comparable to what we call Bimadiziwen, which means the same thing. Live a good life, right? Yeah.
Good, orderly direction. I have always heard that in recovery spaces, but is it universal? As we look forward to the next episode, we will explore if recovery spaces are truly inclusive and healing for all. What if you were raised in a non-Christian context and you want to continue on that path as you recover? Are recovery programs designed for that? When I think about America and how prominent and influential Christianity is everywhere, I know that there is a story to tell. Tune in next episode as I journey alongside faith partners in recovery that have been raised in a completely different religion than my own. Our Stigma is a production of Good Faith Media. This episode was produced by Cliff Vaughn with support from Mitch Randall and Callie Chisholm. Audio provided by Pond 5. Special thanks to Sean and Rolando from Washington County and Diane from mHealth Fairview for their contributions. Thanks to everyone who was interviewed in this episode: Lynne Moratzka, Richard Wright, Tanya, Dr. Steve Delisi, Representative Baker, and Jeremy Drucker. I want to thank the American Indian Family Center, the Minneapolis Indian Health Board. I'm grateful for the support from mHealth Fairview, Washington County, Elam Lutheran Church, and our generous sponsors. I'm Seth Perry, the host, writer, and creator of Our Stigma. If you found this episode meaningful, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show. Visit ourstigma.com, that's ourstigma.com, to explore the educational discussion series that accompanies this podcast. See you for episode 4.